whatever the woman wanted to do, whether it was to have the baby or to have an abortion, that was selfish because she wanted to do it.
Carol Gilligan, welcome to How the Light Gets In.
Thank you, Charlie.
So just to give our audience some background, over 40 years ago you published your landmark book, and in case our audience doesn't know, it's called In a Different Voice, in which you sort of argued that women's voices were left out of the study of moral development. Could you explain why this was?
Actually, no. I mean, in the sense that it's bizarre. Because I'm a psychologist, and at that time, people studied men and wrote about humans, and so Lawrence Kohlberg had a study of 72 boys he followed, and I mean I wasn't even aware of this at the time, except I was interested in how people thought about real dilemmas. I mean, not hypothetical questions, but and I ended up. Through really an accident of history, interviewing women. And I thought, I'm hearing a voice that's different from the voice that I had been, taught and that I was teaching. And then I discovered that psychologists were not listening to women, the reason I said it, how can I explain it? It's in a sense how culture can blind you to the obvious. Because from a psychologist's point of view, women are half the population.
And you argued, or you have argued, that men and women sort of could speak differently or maybe think differently about confronting ethical dilemmas. Do you think, leading on from the previous question a little bit, do you think this is learned, or do you think this is innate, or a mixture of both?
I have to say, I titled my book In a Different Voice. I didn't call it In a Woman's Voice.
Yeah.
And that meant it was a voice that was a different way of speaking about self and moral problems than psychological theories had. So the question I had is, if you've made your theory by listening to men, then if you listen to women, does it add anything? And my answer was yes. That if by not listening to women, now I wrote about a care ethics, and in society, women, and often women of color, do the lion's share of care work. So if you bring in women to talk about moral questions, you are more likely to hear about relationships and caring and paying attention and so forth than if you listen to a group that basically doesn't do that. So I said, I was not interested in are women different from men? It's just, it brought in listening to women alerted me. It's like it tuned my ear to a different voice. And I said, this is an important moral voice.
And what motivated you to write your most recent book, In a Human Voice?
Oh, well, yeah. Because in the 40 years, since In a Different Voice, I spent 10 years studying girls, listening to girls, and then two of my students did really new studies with boys. So those developmental studies and then changes in neuroscience and anthropology made it clear that a voice that was heard when I first was working as a, quote, feminine voice is in fact a human voice. It gets gendered feminine, but it's not, and then I said that then I started writing about what is the culture that genders human capacities, masculine or feminine.
And what do you think is that culture? What did you find out when you...
Well, what I found is that a culture based on the gender binary, which means, we can all do it. If I said to you, what is reason? You would say it's masculine. What is emotion? Feminine. What is the mind? Masculine. What is the body? Certainly the vulnerable body is feminine. What is the self? That's masculine. What's the culture that splits human capacities into masculine or feminine and then privileges the masculine? It's patriarchy. So the initiation, that was my developmental work, with girls, seeing that as girls are initiated into these gender splits And hierarchies they resist because it's going to undermine basic human capacities. And the neuroscientists like Antonio Damasio in his book Descartes' Error, he says to split reason from emotion, it's not a sign of rationality, it's a manifestation of injury or trauma. So it's saying there's a basic tension between this gendered structure of patriarchy and basic human capacities.
And how should we as a society go about in trying to not maybe tear down the patriarchy, but push back against these?
So you think about, what's the opposite of patriarchy, which privileges the voices of fathers, some men over others, all men over women? It's democracy, where everybody has a voice. How do you push back? First of all, you join the resistance of the human psyche toward losing basic relational capacities, because if you're going to set up a hierarchy and say some humans, fathers, are more human than others, men over women, white people over people of color, so forth, you've got to interrupt basic human relational capacities. Otherwise, the people on top will feel the feelings of the people on the bottom, and the people on the bottom have a voice and they will be listened to. So there's a basic tension there.
And are there some worrying elements that you see in today's culture about perhaps the return of more traditional types of masculinity or more traditional types of femininity in the way that Jordan Peterson or others have put forward? Does that worry you at all? And what would those concerns be?
Well, I think that it's a backlash against, the questioning of, there's an extraordinary film that came out last year. It was a finalist for the Oscar in international feature films called Close. And it's about the friendship of two 13-year-old boys. And it shows this just beautiful, close friendship between these two boys. And then the films, they go to school and somebody says to them, "Are you a couple?" And there's a notion of masculinity that doesn't allow for that kind of sensitivity and intimacy and so forth. And you see the cost, the human costs for these children of a masculinity that doesn't really allow that, because it's a joyous friendship, and it's not, as it happens in the film, it's nothing to do with sexuality. And then with girls, the big finding of my research with girls is that as girls approach adolescence, the voice that speaks from their experience tends to go undercover, and they learn what they're supposed to say, what people want them to say. And you can really hear that a human voice goes undercover, and there's a cover voice of how you're supposed to talk and think. But the problem is they're not present. And, there are huge costs of that.
Could you describe in a little bit more detail the study that you were just referring to, of a voice literally going undercover, or not literally, sorry, but going undercover?
No, literally.
Oh, literally,
yeah, literally a voice, because I learned as a researcher that if I didn't question the cover voice, I wouldn't hear the under voice. So I learned, for example, just empirically, as girls reached adolescence, the phrase "I don't know" started to come into their interviews, and it would just increase year after year. 1 year 7 times, then 14, then let's say 28. And it wasn't just an admission of ignorance, "I don't know Einstein's theory of relativity." It was the sense it was a cover for knowledge. And the word "don't," literally, the prohibition had come between I and no. And so I'll give you an example. So a girl says, "I don't like myself enough to look out for myself." And I say, "Do you really feel that way? Because I think that's really sad." She says, "Actually," that was the key word, "actually, this is how I look out for myself, by never saying what I'm feeling and thinking. And that way, no matter what people say about me, I don't care, because they don't know who I am." And then she looks at me and she says, "Brilliant, isn't it?" And I say, yeah, it's a brilliant strategy, but it's at the expense of what she wanted, which is honesty in relationships. And early on in my research, I was interviewing a woman using the kind of dilemmas that philosophers and psychologists use, hypothetical moral dilemma, should a man steal a drug, that kind of thing. She looked at me and she said, would you like to know what I think? Or would you like to know what I really think? Meaning she had learned to think about morality in a way that differed from how she really thought. So to me, the under voice is the voice of how I really think or how I actually feel. And the cover voice is how I think and how I feel. And I mean, I'll give you a very striking example with a man who was part of a study I did of couples in crisis, men and women who had reached an impasse. And he was concerned that his wife was having an affair with a colleague. And he said, it's the ultimate nightmare, her in the arms of another man. And I thought, well, I know the culture where that's the ultimate nightmare, but I can think of worse things, actually. So I said, why is that the ultimate nightmare? That's questioning. And he said, the ultimate nightmare really for me, there's the word again, is never being able to show her how I really feel, there it is, and to be a family man, to open my heart and to love her. So that's underneath the voice of, this is the ultimate nightmare. And I learned that at a certain point, a human voice goes undercover. And my book, In a Human Voice, is saying that when you have this gendered patriarchal structure, the human voice is a voice of resistance. And care ethics is a ethics of liberation, meaning freeing democracy from patriarchy. So that's where my work went.
And what specifically within the patriarchy would you trace that back to? Why? So, for example, with the "I don't know" example, why do you think that starts creeping in gradually into the vernacular?
Well, I mean, that's exactly the question I became interested in.
Yeah.
Like, what function is this serving? And then I thought, if you want to maintain a patriarchal structure which privileges, it's a hierarchy of male privilege and power, certain males, not all males, and so forth. It's maintained. It's an unnatural order. I mean, the anthropologists now say, as humans, we're basically relational beings. So how do you maintain this order? And I would say by male violence or the threat of male violence, which basically upholds this hierarchy of male privilege and power. And I would say by female silence that keeps its secrets, because women are close to men. I mean, we live intimately with men as mothers or sisters or lovers or whatever. And so patriarchy depends on women's silence. I mean, think about Me Too. Suddenly, all of a sudden everybody knows that this is going on, and there had been this incredible silence, or the silence that women broke about sexual abuse, and then suddenly we found out about the Catholic Church and the priests abusing boys. And it's like patriarchy depends on and gives out huge incentives to women. If we don't say what we know firsthand from experience, but learn how you're supposed to talk about morality, how you're supposed to talk about reality, how you're supposed to talk about love, and the interesting thing is artists, I mean, you can go way back to Euripides, or you can go to, right now, Toni Morrison, and all across cultures, the voices of girls have always been in our midst. And so artists picked up this voice of resistance among girls. And you can just think right now, think about Greta Thunberg, this 16-year-old in Sweden, her one-person climate strike. Why does this voice have so much resonance? Or the murder of George Floyd, the black person who was killed by the white policeman. Of all the people who witnessed it, the only one who took out her cell phone and pressed record and filmed it was a 17-year-old girl, Darnella Frazier. And because she did, the white policeman was convicted. So you think, that's the voice. And if you're going to maintain the kind of racism, or if you're going to maintain this denial of climate change, you have to silence that voice. And what's striking to me now is the incentives held out for girls and women.
I was very interested to hear what you said about when women or younger women were approached with trolley problems and ethical dilemmas, they had a different response from some other people. And that's pretty significant, given that in a lot of, let's say, analytic philosophy and the study of ethics, these kinds of hypothetical problems are very important in the way that people construct philosophy. So this must have quite a pernicious impact, not only on the things that you described, but also the study of philosophy, ethics, and in academia universities as well.
Well, you know, when I first started writing about, yes, because, for example, in a classic hypothetical dilemma, it's not the trolley problem, but it's should a man steal a drug if his wife is dying and the drug is overpriced? And so an 11-year-old says, if he stole the drug and he was sent to jail and his wife got sick again, it would only make things worse. There she would be sick. And she also said, where would the drug be? On the shelf in a drugstore? I mean, you start to fill in the situation, and it's a narrative contextual analysis. So she says, you know, he shouldn't steal and the wife shouldn't die. There must be a better way to solve this problem. So, you know, that's what I mean about different. It's not an alternative within the same framework. It's just a different way of talking about it. I think that for many, it was the most unsettling voice I had. In A Different Voice, the center of it is the study of women who were pregnant thinking about abortions after Roe v. Wade. But there was one girl in the book, basically, this Amy, 11-year-old Amy, and her voice was most unsettling for women, many women readers, because you thought she's right. And then thought, but that's the wrong answer. And I compare her with an 11-year-old boy who, you know, does what you're supposed to do, which is to say life is logically prior to property, so he should steal the drug, and so forth and so on.
And one of the panels that you're taking part in later today is the Golden Rule with Daniel Markovits and Peter Seger, and the discussion of that panel focuses around whether the Golden Rule is a legitimate moral law that people should follow, or whether it's a little bit it's had its time, it's a little bit overrated, and it harms certain groups of people. What do you want people to take out of that debate when you take part in it later today?
What I really want people to take out of the debate was my experience in interviewing, again, women. And this was in the 70s, right after Roe v. Wade, where the Supreme Court had said to women, you have a legitimate voice, and under certain constraints, a decisive voice here. And what was really striking to me was women's use of the word selfish. That whatever the woman wanted to do, whether it was to have the baby or to have an abortion, that was selfish because she wanted to do it. And what was good or moral or responsible was to do what other people wanted her to do or thought she should do. And I remember asking women then, if it's moral, if it's good to be empathic with people and responsive to people's needs and concerns, you're a person, why is it selfish to respond to yourself? And woman after woman at that historical moment said, good question. Because women were questioning this notion that to be good meant to be selfless, or as Virginia Woolf said, utterly unselfish. In other words, seemingly without needs or a voice of one's own. Now, why am I telling you that story about the Golden Rule? Because I thought, wow, with the Golden Rule, you would reverse it for women. That the big thing was to treat yourself the way you treat others. You know, that would be the liberation for women, to listen to yourself, to pay attention to yourself, to think about your own knowledge and perceptions just as you think about other people. So it would really turn it the other way around, and that's where I thought the assumption, put yourself in other people's position, there's a certain arrogance to that, that, you know, the way I would want to be treated. But what if your way of dealing with yourself was to, I mean, so interesting, this idea of selflessness as moral for women, which is again the silencing, because women started to see that it was in fact morally problematic because it was an abdication of voice, I mean, making yourself absent, and an evasion of responsibility in a relationship. And if you say, I'm just doing what other people say I should do and so forth, then ultimately you hold them accountable for your actions. So it was a solution that was intended to maintain relationships that ended up just blowing up the relationships. It was fascinating. That's when I started to think about the golden rule.
And who do you think has had the most influence on your academic career?
Oh my goodness. One person?
Doesn't have to be one person. But
it's interesting. I mean, in the very beginning, the person who really drew me back into psychology was Erik Erikson, who said that you can't understand a life or the life history without knowing the history in which it was embedded. And meaning you can't understand psychology without understanding culture and politics and so forth. And you could say that's influence, that sense of life history and history are intricately conjoined. That had a huge influence on me. I think, I took that into my work on women. Recently, Sarah Hrdy, who's an anthropologist, and her extraordinary book, Mothers and Others, The Evolutionary Origins of Mutual Understanding, she had a profound influence on me because she showed that because when, she goes back and she says that because there's such a long time for humans between when we're born and when we reach reproductive capacity, that the child has to engage other people who have to become invested in the child's survival, or the child doesn't survive. So she says, empathy, mind reading, which is true. It's great that young children, if a little child comes into a room and people are upset, the child picks it up and registers it. She says empathy, mind reading, and cooperation were selected for by evolution. And so it just turns the whole developmental question around, because instead of saying, how do we become capable of relationships? How do we learn to take the point of view of the other? All the things I'm sure you learned too, I learned too. It's the opposite. How do we lose the capacity to pick up and register other people's feelings? How do we lose the capacity to love? It's just that if you see a person who's emotionally clueless, as some men are described as being, or someone who seems to have no voice, like some women, what you have to say is, what happened to this human being? And I thought her work was brilliant. I teach it.
Fantastic. Carol Gilligan, thank you very much.
Thank you, Charlie.